when people are in early stages of loss, they need to know some things. People have equated profound loss, particularly sudden loss, to getting a concussion. And so those amygdala and the brain from the very base is not sending the proper signals. Sometimes I need to imagine myself breaking plates. There is a whole constellation of people who need high intensity physical experience. I don't want my mother's death to be the thing that defines the rest of the way that I live. When people come into my office and say, my mom died 10 years ago, but I haven't processed any of the grief, one thing that I usually say is,
hey, welcome back to another episode of Good Grief. Today, we are going to be sitting down with psychotherapist Meghan Riordan Jarvis to talk about why feeling your feelings are a lie. Can you believe it or not? Get ready. This episode is going to be jam-packed. And if you're here for the first time, welcome. You're in for a treat. If you're returning as one of our Good Grief family, then you're in the right place. And if you haven't yet, take a moment just to rate the podcast. That would help us spread this message with these incredible guests to more people and help us on our mission to help 1 million women through grief. But without further ado, let's get down to it. Meghan, it's great to have you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, when I reached out to you, I was, believe it or not, sitting in the car waiting for my wife to finish the grocery shopping. And I'm like, I'm just going to hit up Meghan because you're doing amazing stuff and we got to connect. That's the story.
Well, the rest of the story is I was like, yes, let's absolutely connect. And then I left you hanging in my WhatsApp for like 6 months. And I found it the other day and I was like, oh my God, I never got back to you.
But that's because you've had a lot going on. I can see behind you, there's a new book coming.
There is. Yeah. I have a new book called Can Anyone Tell Me? Essential Questions About Grief and Loss, it's 35 chapters of all the things that I, as a therapist and as a griever, really think we should be talking about, teaching about, and supporting both grievers through their process, but also the book supports supporters. So there's a section in each chapter that sort of says, hey, if you're the griever, maybe try this, think about this, look into this. And if you're the supporter, think about this, do this, try that.
Super needed. I'm going to be picking up. Just give us the quick, is it October 29th? Do I have that date right?
Yeah, October. Look at you. You're good. Yep. So it's October 29th. And if people are interested, there's going to be a little, if you get the book early, and right around when it comes out, you can come and be part of these 3 classes that we're going to do. We're going to pick 3 of the most provocative chapters. I think we're picking, Can Anyone Tell Me Why My Brain is Broken? And we'll be talking about sort of the limbic response to trauma. Then we're going to do, Can Anyone Tell Me Why I Hate All My Friends and Family? And we're going to talk about sort of how attachments really get disrupted when you go through a real profound loss. And then we're going to do, Can Anyone Tell Me Why I Think That Butterfly Is My Mom? We're going to talk about spirituality in grief and how for some people it becomes augmented and, more profound. And for other people, it falls out from underneath them and they sort of, can lose their sense of self. Yeah.
I wouldn't know which one to choose if I had them in front of me. So that's going to be a tough one. But you talked about those are real juicy topics. And we just introed this session by saying, you're feeling your feelings is a lie. Can we just jump in there? Tell me why my feelings or feeling my feelings are a lie.
Yeah. So I have a lot of respect and a lot of gratitude for the people on social media who are trying to crack open the silence around grief and loss. I think they're doing extraordinary things. I think they're creating community where there hasn't been community before. And I think they're really offering their own personal experience to other people in a way that is like a gift, the way that writing a memoir is. And I think there's a bunch of stuff on social media that gets circulated it's almost like the new 5 stages of grief, which we know aren't real, are going to be supplanted with these significant memes that everyone has seen that also don't really help. And one of them is grievers just need to feel their feelings. That's everywhere. If you Google, what should I do if I'm grieving? Number 1 or number 2 is feel your feelings. But feeling your feelings is how we get into bar fights for some people. Feeling your feelings is where alcoholism comes from. Feeling your feelings is how people binge eat. Feeling your feelings is how we gamble and we shop, and we can't just assume that everybody is able to feel that amount of feeling. So what drives me crazy about grief and loss is we just act like everybody knows how to do it. We've never really seen it done. It's not depicted well on the television. We tend to sort of put people, like, please go do that in your therapy hour on your, during lunchtime, and then like kind of don't talk about it anymore. We just don't have any models for it. But the idea of just feel all your, like, even a minute ago, you and I were talking about US politics. You saying to me, Megan, just feel all your feelings about US politics. Like, that's going to make it really hard for me to do anything else.
I didn't say that, by the way.
You did not. You were much more. But so that idea of just sort of like feeling your feelings is enough. Is actually, it's just not correct. That for a lot of people, what that means is that's not what we do with folks when they're overwhelmed. Their central nervous system is overwhelmed. When feeling their feelings makes them feel panicky or sends them into depression and despair. We don't just feel all our feelings. We process through the feelings. So we give them these tools to sort of like, get in it, but also get out. So, we don't package it up, but it's a tool.
Yeah. And what I'm thinking here is that if we want the next step after feeling our feelings is acting on our feelings. And that's never a good thing to always be acting on our feelings. Bar fights. That's a great example. Totally.
Yeah, that's right. So again, we have to be wiser than that. When people come into my office and say, my mom died 10 years ago, but I haven't processed any of the grief. One thing that I usually say is you probably have more than you thought. I think what you mean is you didn't cry a lot, but crying is only one form of processing grief. There's a lot of ways that we process grief. And two, there may have been wisdom in the delay, right? Like maybe you had a tiny baby at that time. And so getting totally emotionally overwhelmed would not have been good for you. So, there's some instinctive stuff that needs to be supported and explained and taught. Like, I always use the example we teach in this country. All three of my kids who are teenagers now took classes in puberty, but took health classes that described the processes of puberty so that when weird things, hair started to grow where it wasn't before, and their voices started to crack, or that they didn't think something terrible was happening.
And we just don't get that in school yet. Or maybe some schools. I don't know what you're seeing in the US, but
we have that, but we don't have it for grief and loss. We get it for puberty, but we have no education in any format that sort of says like, no, memory loss, totally common. I'm always teaching people multi-stepped instructions so I can do one thing, and then maybe two things, but not three things. Just a minute ago, I said to my husband, can you read this email? It had like 5 steps to it. And I was like, am I having trouble with this because of ADD? Am I having trouble with this because, and he was like, no, that's a really hard email. There's too much information. But because I have some neuro stuff and I have been a griever, I can't always tell what is what in terms of following instructions, not sleeping, not eating, being incredibly irritable and reactive. These are all super common experiences that even primary care doctors don't always know are sort of standard grief responses. And that makes me nuts because people suffer with that. They end up sort of minimizing their symptoms or not talking about them after, let's say, 3 or 4 months. And those symptoms do need to be brought up, felt, and processed through. And most people I know don't know how to process grief because people don't talk about it and we don't see people do it.
And so from a therapist standpoint, what do you feel is the most misunderstood aspect of grief that other therapists even get wrong?
I think it's that I don't think it's just about feeling. And the other side of the coin of feeling your feelings is sort of guided more towards the supporter, which is like, you just have to bear witness, so bear witness, just be there and listen and don't try to fix, which is true, except also when people are in early stages of loss, they need to know some things. They
We
need to
need a bit
know
of
that
help.
like we need macronutrients in order to create
Mhm.
serotonin. So you need to be ultimately to create serotonin, because we need the amino acids inside the protein, and we need the fats, and we need the carbs. So people can't just eat pizza for 20 days. You got to be encouraging them to get some nourishment. So there is like some core grief education that I think therapists are not trained in. I mean, I know they're not trained in it because there's
Mhm.
really only a couple of certification courses in this country, and none of them are required. You don't have to take any classes in grief and loss to be a therapist in any of the ways you can get those licenses here.
Yeah, wow.
So most people that I'm teaching, and I teach a lot of therapists, most people that I'm teaching are like, oh, this is the first time I'm learning this. So, we do a lot of the let's talk about the limbic system response, the fight, flight, freeze, and response. Let's talk about the fact that we have 12 systems in our body, right? Like your digestive tract and your respiratory tract and your endocrine tract. We talk about what does it look like when those things are experiencing trauma, so that
So,
you can
so can
teach
we
that to
talk
your
about
clients.
Yeah, so can we talk about fight, flight, and freeze? I think really important. And I feel like I want to circle back to, you mentioned delayed grief, that people feel guilt and shame around that. And it's got to do with these three areas that we think have a defined timeline. Can you talk to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, very basically, I always say, like, if I have 20 minutes, I can just teach you something that you don't know, because most people's understanding of the fight, flight, and freeze responses is just like a mess. In the most basic sense, the brain is a predictive tool. It takes the information that it's already experienced, pulls up those tracks, and puts them forward based on what it thinks it's going to need. So if I'm going to the beach tomorrow, my brain is using my past experiences of the beach to say, bring this bathing suit, bring, sunscreen, you might get hot.
Sure,
New
that makes sense.
experiences
Yeah.
right? New
Yeah.
experiences that I have at the beach, then I update that template about the beach. There are certain experiences that our body intrinsically responds to as a threat. And it is based on subconscious cues and conscious cues, and your tiny little amygdala that are at the base of your brain in your limbic system. They're like shaped like almonds. They enlarge. And what that does when it enlarges is it acts like a dam across where the currency of electricity goes from the back of your brain up to your prefrontal cortex. This is where we do let me think about that.
Yeah.
So when those two little amygdala enlarge in order to protect us, a million things begin. The blood rushes to our chest. That's one of the primary signals that's sent, so that it can protect our vital organs, just in case the thing that is threatening us is a bear and it's going to tear our limbs off. The part that I always ask grievers to focus on is this whole thing is all the mechanisms, all of the ways in which we get information down into the body. There's one nerve, your 10th cranial nerve. The vagus nerve sends messages up into the body and takes messages up into the brain from the body, takes messages from the brain back down into the body. When those amygdala enlarge, they cut off the electricity.
It's blocked.
Yeah, so I always say it's like a mailman trying to go over a bridge and the bridge washes out. And so now the mailman is like throwing the mail in the general direction of the mailboxes.
Great.
They don't all get where they're supposed to go. Some of them wash down the system. Some of them get into the wrong mailbox. And then the people in the houses respond based on the mail they got. And so now they're sending bad messages back into the body, into those 12 systems, your digestive tract, your reproductive tract, your respiratory tract, your hair and skins and nails, your augmentary tract. So those messages are screwed up. And now the body is going to send screwed up messages back up into the brain. And that's how we get central nervous system dysregulation, right? Yeah. What's really critical, and most people don't know, is that fight, flight, and freeze. Let's just take those. There are some add-ons, but fight, flight, and freeze are progressive. We always fight first. We always flee second. And then we go into freeze. Fight
That is
and
very
flight
interesting.
come from the sympathetic part of your nervous system, the activated part of your nervous system. Freeze and collapse are in the parasympathetic nervous system. Freeze and collapse are where trauma happens. If you're able to run away, if you're able to fight your way free and run away from something, you are more likely to energetically get that trauma out of the body. But you can't run away from death. You can't fight it. And a lot of people find themselves frozen because there's so much information that doesn't make any sense. Because, when my mom died, I had PTSD after my mom died, but I just remember saying, like, I don't understand who I am now. She was such a center tent pole to my own experience and my own understanding of who I was and what I cared about in the world, that when she wasn't there to sort of look to, like little kids, when you're at a playground, They look to their mom and their mom's like, you can do it. And then they climb the slide. I was a grown up by the time my mom died, but I'd never stopped doing that. So the limbic system response is a full contact sport. And it can get reactivated over and over and over again. And so early grief, the game of early grief is to calm that physical system down, is to ask that physical system to interrupt the bad mail, to build the bridge back. And that, to answer your question, Ryan, that is what most grief therapists don't know how to do, is teach that regulation back.
So important. You said there that it is a full-on contact sport. Why do you think it's so that we think that it's the grand final when we experience grief, and once it's over, we're not going to have to face that opponent again?
Wishful thinking. And also there are lots of things that we are able to do, kind of go through and do, right? Like I had to do a hard thing at work and give a presentation. I was super nervous and I couldn't sleep the night before. But then when I moved through it, I wasn't nervous anymore. The problem with grief, and Mary Frances O'Connor talks about this so beautifully in her book, The Grieving Brain, is it's this insane learning process. And again, I often equate it to, like, when I sent my middle guy, when I sent him to preschool, he came home that afternoon. It was only 3 hours. He's like 4. And he came home and he like crushed 2 juice boxes. And then he ate like 2 fistfuls of crackers. And then he fell asleep on the couch. It was like he had been a nurse who had worked a double shift,
Sure.
But I think part of what was happening for him was that he had been for 3 hours asked to do everything different than he'd ever done it before. So he needed to line up. He needed to put the trucks back in the red box. He needed to learn this cleanup song. He needed to keep his hands to himself. All the things. Grief is like that.
Learning mode. Yeah.
Your brain is trying to reorient itself. It used to have a different compass point, and that is how the boat knew where to go. And now it doesn't know. And it's not true with every loss, right? But I'm talking about the kind of profound loss that really, you and I talk to people about, where it reorganizes the whole chessboard.
And we try and use reason, right, to pair up with the emotional side. The two sides of our brain. Can you unpack that a bit? Like I know, I'm just speaking from personal experience. I like logic. I like reason. I like lists and tasks getting completed and crossing them off. And that's how my brain works. And 1 + 1 = 2 to me. But in grief, I experienced mathematics in my brain that I'd never even seen. And my psychologist told me that it was like trying to use addition for art.
Yeah. That's great. The people have equated profound loss, particularly sudden loss, to getting a concussion, right? Like in one of those old cartoons where like the Roadrunner hits, the other guy with a frying pan. Like
his brain comes out.
Yeah. And you're just kind of ringing like a gong. Like the part that we just talked about with the limbic system, it's not like that happens once. It's not like you pick up the phone and they say your dad died and then you have a limbic response and then you're just regulating it.
Totally.
The limbic response goes on and on and on because we're talking about death, and that is literally the ultimate threat to the system. So what some people experience is this intensity of thinking. They have ruminations and they have these intrusive thoughts because the brain is like, let's go over it again. Let's go over it again. So then on Monday, what happened? Like, let's check. Yeah. And it feels, I mean, for me, when my mom died, it really felt like I was blaming myself. And I was like, okay, well, you must have done something or not done something that could have prevented her from dying. Let's figure out what it is. Start from the beginning. And so we're trying to do this thinking, but remember, those amygdala and the brain from the very base is not sending the proper signals. So it's like what I say to my kids. If they're trying to talk to me about something important at 8:30, I'm like, nope, we're not talking about it right now.
Wrong time.
Because you are tired, and we are not good rational thinkers when we're tired, because the quality of the currency and the ability of my brain, everyone knows what it's like to be exhausted and say like, oh, I can't read. That happens with grievers. That's the thing they say. I couldn't read for 2 years. And that's not because you suddenly got stupid. It's because what it takes to train your eyes on the graphics, your brain is using that like the gasoline in a car. It's using that energy really honestly to just keep you breathing and to help you sleep and to give you hunger cues. It's like the basic needs of a baby kind of all over again.
Wow. It's like the basic needs of a baby all over again. That has never been more real for me with our first child now, seeing her and how much she needs us to survive. And now thinking about that in reflection, wow. When my dad died, it was like everything just went out the window. The brain completely untangled and unwired itself from the things that it needed to do. I mean, we've spoken a little bit about food. You mentioned a little bit about energy and the right time for things. You mentioned like kids at 8:30 at night. The right thing at the wrong time is the wrong thing.
It's the wrong thing. Yeah.
When you step into grief, especially for the first time, what are the basics? What are the necessities that get neglected?
So just to say it, the book, Can Anyone Tell Me? It has so much information that's in it. It's written almost like a guidebook. And so it has some of the stuff that we're talking about in it. But my team and I have also built this thing called the Grief Mentor Method, which is designed to answer the question that you are asking right now, which is like when a griever says, what am I supposed to do now? So there's the early grief, which is like, no, you just got knocked into the ocean and you're just trying not to drown. So in early grief, what I say to people is water, macronutrients, right? So macronutrients meaning protein, carbohydrates, and healthy fats. I don't care if you also eat gummy bears, but you need those or your body's not going to tick. It's not going to do what it needs to do. And some movement. And then, some people also say like, and connection, and don't isolate. My three things are the food and the water and some movement. The movement will help you sleep and get rest. If you can tolerate connection, then we do the connection. We're not going to leave connection out the window, but for a lot of people, much like a baby, their central nervous system is so overwhelmed. They're so irritated, right? Like it's like they're walking around with like a rash on their skin. And so being around people that are not part of their inner sanctum, people who could let them fly off the handle, it's almost like it's dangerous. I certainly burned some because I get my kind of irritation is anger. And I definitely burned some relationships to the ground. Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people who are, and again, it's not something that we really talk about. It's just like, I wasn't angry that my mom died. My mom was 75 years old. She died in her bed holding her rosary. I was just angry because of how my body felt and how exhausted and confused I was and how unlike myself I was to me. That is what I was angry about.
And did you have anger as a part of your character and personality? Because I've got high anger trait in my personality. Did you have that, or did that come about because of the trauma, the grief?
So, it's interesting that you ask that, because most of my life, so up until my early 20s, I was a real deep people pleaser, kind of in a codependent way. So I really liked everyone else to be happy. And I would have told you I'm rarely angry. Well,
Sure.
Enough work with a really good therapist. And I am an amazing angry person, meaning I did all the got irrationally angry and over angry and reactively angry. And then the sort of pendulum. So I'm great with anger now. I'm great with being angry. Anger is actually a good friend to me.
It's a great motivator.
Well, it tells the truth. And so, and also, oh my God, I mean, I can be very spiteful and pissed off. And so when people piss me off, I'm like, just step to the left. I'm going to get it done anyway. Get out of my way.
So good.
So I'm really comfortable with anger. The kind of anger that I had when my mom died was irrationally accusatory. And because I was a trauma therapist, I had seen other people have it so often. Suddenly their beloved brother was the most selfish person they had ever met after their dad died. And I heard enough stories to be like, that's not possible. You didn't misread your brother your whole life, and then your dad died, and now you've finally come to terms with the fact that he's a terrible person. That's not what's happening. So I was able to have some lens of that, but oddly, I wasn't able to stop my reactivity a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. So mostly what I did was hide. I would hide because I was like a ticking bomb. I was like, I will fly off the handle. And I did fly off the handle a couple of times in ways that, can't be really forgiven.
Yeah, this is super good for people to hear coming from a professional, that it's
right.
It's totally normal, right? It's
normal and it's biological, right? Just
yes.
Think about anything. For any of you who study a foreign language, think about what it's like to be in that country and not be able to retrieve words, and you're trying to communicate with someone. It's similar to that. You're pissed, and you're almost pissed at them for not understanding you. It's like that. You're trying to understand this foreign language and this foreign land so that you can function. Everyone else speaks whatever this language is fluently. I don't mean grief. I mean, they're still in a world where it's not grief. And you're over here just trying to function. So it's that kind of irritability where it's it's not really anybody's fault, but it is actually still happening. And I'm probably going to get mad at whoever's around.
And then you've got the irritability of grief being a new language, if that's what we're saying. It is a new language that we have to learn. And you get angry because other people don't speak that language because they've never experienced it themselves.
Yeah, and we lie about that too. We lie about that too. We say that people who, we just assume, this happens at work a lot. We're my mom dies, I go into work, and Kathy from HR, whose mother died, who nobody likes, by the way, Kathy is the one who comes in and says how you doing? And you know what, Kathy, you are the last person I want to talk to. And then Kathy starts to talk to me about her experience with her mother dying. And I'm like, what are you talking about? That doesn't sound anything like my experience. And I don't want to be talking to you. So I do think there's also this assumption that once you go through it, it's I don't know, like going through menopause or something. Once you go through it, you understand all the symptoms, and then you can talk to anyone about it. And that's, I talk a lot about this, and can anyone tell me when people are trying to support each other, I have a lot of words for the supporter, which is is it really you? Are you the person who should be stepping up here? Check That's your great. Orbit, meaning how close to the sun, if the griever is the sun, how close to the sun are you really? Would they pick you back? Are you the person? You should check and get consent. And do you really have it? Do you have time to show up? Because it's not going to be 2 weeks long.
It's not a one and done.
Yeah, and then also, what are you doing to increase your capacity to show up for this person? What are you doing to understand that they're going to get angry? What are you doing to check your language so that you don't shut them down accidentally? What are you doing so that you have somebody who's filling your bucket so that you can fill your griever's bucket?
Oh, so good.
Yeah, there's a lot perfect. Of it's not just teach the griever the language. It's teach everybody what it takes. And it just takes much more than we wanted to.
Oh, 100%. It takes way more. And it's an exponential curve, isn't it? We can't see what's ahead because it's over the mountain.
No. But we do learn to carry it. I mean, we do it's building muscles, and we do learn kind of our own, like our own sort of grief hunger cues. And every once in a while, anyone will tell you, you get the like waves of grief that are unpredictable. But even that, you kind of learn, like, I don't try to ride those out anymore. I'm like, oh, well, that's the day show. Gotta go and get in bed. You learn how to do some of that stuff. It doesn't stop the grief. The grief is a part of your life forever, but it does, you are less afraid of it, and you do have better muscles for it.
Less afraid of it and better muscles for it. That's awesome. What are some of your stimuli that you realize the grief is coming?
Oh yeah. It's interesting. When I work with companies, one of my most popular classes is about neurodiversity, just like in general.
Great.
And I have married neurodiversity with grief, because I ask people, like, how many of you don't like tags in the back of your sweater? How many of you hate wearing shoes? How many of you can't stand overhead lights? How many of you go to sleep listening to music? How many of you can't eat after 5? All of that is just diversity in terms of like how our bodies and our brains process information, right? So what I know is if I get a catch in my throat where my voice is starting to break, I am already like at a 7 with grief. There's already grief that I haven't tended to. I think of grief, and in the grief mentor method, this is how we construct it. It's a daily practice. The same way eating and sleeping and exercising is a daily practice. So you have to have a daily check-in, and then we teach these tools of how to check in. And then you come to understand which tools work better for you. And then you use them. So when I get a catch in my throat, I have a whole meditation practice that I do. The other thing that will happen is I call it sort of like a record scratch. I'll be somewhere, and it doesn't bring me to my knees, but I will see something that reminds me of my mom or my dad, or somebody will say something, and for 1 second, I feel deeply and profoundly alone. And I have this tool, which I call the triangle of trust, where I text 3 people what just happened. I'm in a meeting and someone just mentioned my mom's favorite song. And that's it. I just text 3 people, and I use 3 people, because you can't assume that anyone is going to be available. Like, some people might be in a meeting for 20 hours. And I have deliberately picked people with different personalities. So one of them, my best friend, she's very empathetic, and she'll be like, I can call you right now. Do you need to talk? And usually I don't. And then my sister will say something, kind of like a distraction, like, oh my God, yes, mom's favorite song. And also, did you see in that magazine, there were cookie cutters, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
So she'll distract me. And then my third friend who I text will say,
Please tell me she's a funny friend.
She will, it's like Goldilocks, but she will say like, oh, that freaking sucks. And so between the 3 responses, and sometimes I'll only get 1, I will feel less alone in that moment.
It's awesome.
And that's what I've learned is really bad for grievers, is to feel like you are you are, by the way, you are alone. You are the only person in that moment who is experiencing that. But it doesn't mean you need to be like existentially alone.
No, that's right. Because grief is a story of one. It's your relationship with that person that's different to your brother, your mother, whoever. But it doesn't mean you have to stay in that silo.
Yeah. I mean, what I say is any emotion that's over a 5. So if 0 is I'm asleep, and 5 is like, I'm just like getting shit done, doing my regular life, and 10 is a panic attack. Anything that's 5, 6, 7, I usually need to say whatever that is. I was watching something on climate change and I'm feeling really afraid. Like, I need to let people know so that it doesn't absorb inside my system and begin to collect.
Sure.
So I'm pretty vigilant with those numbers. That's my grief practice, is just sort of check in, but there will be days where I'm like, oh my God, my voice is cracking. How did that happen? And that's never just in this moment I'm having feeling. Feeling has been collecting and I wasn't paying attention.
It's been building. Sure.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. You said that's sort of like a 7. So at what point do you realize I've got to like retreat and I've got to go into my space and do the work? Like where does it get to there? And how does that show up? Maybe have you had those moments with clients where you actually have something rise up inside of you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I haven't been doing client work for the past couple of years. So I haven't had this for the past couple of years with clients, but historically with clients, absolutely. And I know different people have different ways of approaching it. What I think works the best for me in all cases is curiosity. So curiosity is one of the things that sort of dims when you're in trauma. Like you don't want to be curious about what that bear's fur feels like when you're in trauma. So it's almost like the dial dies down.
Well, I'll tell you, just to pause on that, curiosity gets squashed as soon as we leave kinder, or like as soon as we enter school, curiosity gets crushed. So it's no reason why when it comes to grief, we lose all forms of being curious about how we're feeling, the person we lost, all of those things.
And it is a trauma reaction that part of our brain is not very active. Like we can see that on fMRIs. And so, but you can be invited back into curiosity. Just because you are in trauma doesn't mean you can't be invited back into regulation, right? So when I would suddenly feel energy in my body, when a client was saying something, I would just say that, just a second. I'm totally distracted by the fact that I have like a cloud of energy in my body based on what you're saying. And, would I do that every time? No, but I do it if it was a 7. I do it and I'd say, right. I wonder what it is. And I don't think I would name the emotion. Like, I don't think I would turn it into a feeling by saying like, oh, I'm feeling angry. I think I would just say there's a lot of energy. There's a lot of emotion. And I still do that in my grief practice because I don't always assume I know what's going on with me. Like, I mean, your listeners may know, but emotions are unconscious electrical currents that run through the body a gajillion times a day. They turn into feelings when we put words on them. So our ability to assign the correct language to the electrical current is what makes it what it is. I am not a genius at that. So because I spent most of my life trying not to have any feelings or emotions. So I sometimes have to say, like, I have this kind of like lost my wallet feeling of like, I'm a little confused and I'm a little out of sorts and I'm a little out of place and I don't know what it is. And then I usually will sit down and be like, when did it happen? And it's like, oh, it happened when I was on that podcast, or it happened when I was on that phone call. And then it's like, oh, I was afraid because that person said they were going to come visit me at Christmas and I'm not going to be here at Christmas. Like, oh, that's what that's about. So I have to sometimes like walk my way all the way back to the origin of when it happened. And I can only do that with curiosity. Curiosity is the only thing that will like lead me there. And then when I'm there, I like to also be curious of like, oh, well, then what do I need to do? A lot of times what I do is just imagine myself crumpling up the thing and throwing it away. Like, I don't need it. Throw it away. That works for me. Sometimes I said this to you before. Sometimes I need to imagine myself breaking plates because you know what? Whatever it was in the constellation of anger or frustration. I need to get it out of my system. And that's not crumpling paper. That's breaking plates.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was in a metal band for 6 years in the period when my dad was killed. And so it was the perfect outlet to like be on stage with this energy of hundreds of kids, just like jumping off speakers and screaming and shouting. And it was a really, really good outlet. If anyone's listening that hasn't tried metal music and you've shunned it for so long, it could be a great little outlet.
Do you know, I mean, you're saying that with such a smile on your face, but so the root of the grief mentor method, we really do talk about, like, part of how it began was I had a whiteboard in my office and I would just write down in permanent pen on this board anything anyone told me helped them with grief and loss. And there is a whole constellation of people who need high intensity physical experience, right? So a mosh pit is going to help them get all the energy out of their body in a way that nothing else is going to. Also, really loud, intense noise is an incredible mechanism for some people to sort of move energy through the body. And so that when we're doing the grief mentor method, we're not your mentor. You become your own mentor. You are going to tell us what works for you, but we ask a million questions, right? Like
amazing.
One of the questions we ask is, where do you find yourself the most emotional? By yourself or with other people? Where do you find yourself the most satisfied and emotional? By yourself or with other people? I'm a person who would not cry by myself. I need to be at least on the phone with somebody else in order to feel safe enough to do that. Where I really like to cry, crowded airport. Does that make other people feel good? Absolutely not. But crying in a room full of strangers is so good for me. Other people, that would give them a panic attack. They're going to cry in the shower. They're going to cry quietly. They're going to have, but you can see that the assumption that one thing helps people is totally bogus. We don't even all like the same drink or food. But I absolutely believe, because I'm a big fan of big headphones and a lot of sound in my head, that a metal band would be the most cathartic grief process for some percentage of the population. I totally believe
word. Total perfect word. Hey, maybe I'll pull the band back together and we can play a show just for you.
Telling you, there's a TV show here. It's over now. The series is over, but it had Christina Applegate on it, and her character sits in a car and listens to speed metal after her husband dies. And it's just like, a yelling noise. And she's like, no, it's the best. It soothes me. It helps me fall asleep.
Good.
Yeah.
Oh, so good. A couple of things I want to circle back to here. You were talking about emotions becomes feelings when we put words to them. So I find it so fascinating, the power of our words and our speech and our self-talk when we put words to things, because a mentor of mine, Myron Golden, says that we can speak without thinking, but we can't think without speaking. Right. Sorry, we can speak. Yeah, let me get it right. We can speak without thinking, and we know that that's true because we say dumb stuff and we go, I should have thought about that before I said it. But we can't think without words.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
And so it makes sense when you talk about emotions and feelings.
Yeah, so that's not my work. That comes from Mark Barrett and Linda Feldman Barrett. They're not related. Mark is at the Center for Emotional Studies at Yale, and Linda has written this big book, but they're really like the neuroscientists that I rely on. They're not both neuroscientists, but they're the scientists that I rely on to sort of teach me about how the body works and how we sort of study the energy that moves through. I think the point you're making about the language is super critical. So again, the grief mentor method, it's like M stands for something. M is mindfulness,
it's
and
an
E
acronym,
is energy, and N is knowledge. T is translation. So we spend a lot of time talking to people about what is the story that you tell yourself about your loss. And then what is the story that you tell other people? And the example that I use is I had a young woman who I worked with who had lost her brother. He had been murdered. And she just found that she could not connect with people. And the sort of story she was inventing in her head was that like people could not handle the fact that her brother had died and they didn't want to talk about it. But when we got into it, the story that she told herself was that her brother got murdered. That was the story she was telling herself. And that was the same sentence she was saying to people. People said, tell me about yourself. And she would say, well, my brother was murdered when I was 14. And what she learned in that process was people didn't know what to say to her after that. Totally. What they wanted to say was, how did he die? Right? Because that's what happens when you say the word murder. And what she wanted to talk about was what a funny stand-up comedian he was, how thoughtful he was, how all of her taste in music was. So she needed to morph both the story that she told herself. She needed to shift the idea that the most important thing about his life was how he died, and in fact pivot it. So then she started saying things like, I lost my best friend when I was 14.
Sure.
And then that was a much more engaging conversation, right? And then she was able to do the thing that she wanted to do. So we spend a lot of time, and we do that, right? Like I begin to define my experience based on what I'm telling myself about it.
And we do that about every circumstance in
Everything.
our world. Yes.
Everything. Yeah.
That's powerful. Can we go a little deeper on the stories that we embody here?
Yeah.
I think this is a really important subject. And for many people, most people, I'll say, because in the marketing world that I've come from in business, we learn to tell stories and we have to unpack those stories so that people can understand them. But when we're just living our lives and we've got families and then we come across loss and trauma and grief, we don't think about what the story is, because the story just seems like it is only one way. There's only one story here and there are not multiple narratives.
Yeah.
Can you just pull that apart a little bit more?
Well, so you said it a minute ago, I lost my mother. My 5 brothers and sisters lost their mother. So there isn't a shared story even of experience, but there is the shared human experience of loss. And I think one of the things that we say is we're like, well, everyone needs to use their empathy and bring up their experience and connect to somebody else. But there's all this data that shows us that people who are high on empathy also have higher levels of trauma. So you kind of want to be, so you want to be careful about saying like you need to go to the well of your own personal experience to be able to pull up your emotions, which are going to be, dripping with your experience, and then connect to somebody else. So Penamaker, this extraordinary, he's like an advocate for journal writing, tells us that some of the brain damage that happens, and it is brain damage that happens, your synapses inside your brain and your neural pathways, they really do get damaged during this trauma, that you can awaken them by writing. And so, one of the things that we use is we use a whole series of journal prompts. People can come to my website and sign up for them, and they happen on Mondays, they happen on Mondays when we're doing them properly. We've been a little lax lately, but the idea of doing the journal prompts is less about the content and more about being in the process. And, that's the thing about grief and loss. David Kessler talks a lot about finding meaning. What he'll tell you is the finding is the important part, right? It's not the landing on the spot of meaning. It's that you don't want the terrible thing that happened to you to be the last meaningful thing in your life. I don't want my mother's death to be the thing that defines the rest of the way that I live. I want to transform it. I want there to be some traumatic growth so that her life, as I reflect back to that period of time, becomes the little fire. Even if all it does is get me to walk more, or even if all it does is get me to call my sister more, we don't all have to start a foundation or write a book. That's not realistic.
No, that's right.
That's not who we are.
Yeah.
But I do think the idea that we define our experiences with our words and we allow ourselves to sort of see what's possible and hopeful, we have to kind of have a growth edge on that, because when you are in trauma, nothing feels hopeful. I have a client who, her husband died suddenly, and she said, I am never going to get married again. I am never going to love anyone again. I will never want to even spend time with anyone again. And what I said was, I know, I believe you. And just so you hear this, I think it's possible you will somewhere down the line. So if you want to hope it, it's there. If you don't want to hope it, you don't have to. Because I don't want to land on, yeah, you're right, it's always going to be shitty and it's never going to get any better. But do I need to acknowledge that is the truth of her life right now? 100%. It is true. This is the worst thing. And you can't imagine anything good ever happening. But one of the reasons why memoir and how we use film, music, one of the reasons why that art modality, poetry, painting is so powerful is it gives us something to do with all the emotion, right? It gives us a process to be in. And then we look back on it and we're like, oh, I made that when I was having all those feelings. I couldn't make that again today. I say this all the time. I'm really grateful I wrote a memoir when I did. I wrote End of the Hour when I was like in it, when I was really trying to figure out what kind of a life am I going to have. I couldn't write that book now. I don't feel that way anymore.
Oh, I so resonate with you.
Right?
I'm a big fan of writing, and like I've just got my phone here open with notes, right? I'm just taking little notes, but like ever since I've owned an Apple iPhone, notes have been just the best place to thought dump. And when Dad died 2012, I remember waking up in the middle of the night, bawling my eyes out already, and I'd been sleeping. My phone, which I don't keep next to my bedside table now, but at the time I needed it, and I would just jot all of these thoughts. These thoughts would just come. And that became our album that we eventually released a couple of years later. It formed the content that I needed when it came to release songs that ended up touching people that had experienced loss. And so big fan of writing. It's very cathartic. And the reflection piece is like, you can see how far you've come.
And, honestly, because I did a lot of writing, Andrew Garfield, who has a beautiful podcast with Anderson Cooper, it's kind of everywhere.
Yeah, I saw you talking about that. I haven't had a chance to listen just yet.
He talks about having done some writing. Anderson Cooper reads back to him this piece, and he's like, I don't even really remember writing that. And I really relate to that because I've written, 300 blog posts. I would wake up at 3 a.m. I was having trouble sleeping. I would write the most beautiful, most poetic, I look back at that writing and I'm like, God, that is so laden with feeling and metaphor and whatever. And I don't remember writing it. And here's the thing, and I may lose everybody right here, but that's when I think we are connected to the channel of actually global grief. I think when we're in our art, the kind of quantum physics of all the grief that has been left behind by all the people who have died and all of the grief that is present in our moments right now. Like, think about when you're at a concert and everybody has chills at the same time.
That's it.
There are not that many things that we do as humans that are collective in that way. But I really think that when you are, and I have chills when I'm saying this right now, when you are in that kind of like untenable place that so many other people already survived, I do think maybe you call into you some wisdom about, and really that's what art is for, maybe.
Yeah.
And art 100%. And movement and all the things, right? It's to like interpret and channel and move through and sort of take it in, but also get it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man, so good. It's funny. Hey, right now, like my laptop is sitting on a stack of grief books. It's like what we use to prop things up. And I'm just thinking about all of these people who have gone before us. And C.S. Lewis comes to mind, Problem of Pain. And those early writings got me through. And I'm just thinking he was in the depths of it when he wrote those raw, honest thoughts. And we get to somehow, like, you're in the middle of the night, me in the middle of the night, we are channeling the same grief that he was writing about all that time ago. And it is collective and it is powerful.
Yeah. And we're just leaving each other words on the wall, right? Like totally. That's it. Is like you pick up C.S. Lewis and somebody else going through a divorce is picking up Maggie Smith, beautiful. You could make this place beautiful, her poetry or her book. And other people are, going to a movie or a piece of art or, a dance recital. And they are like, yes, that I got completely when my dad died 2 years before my mom of small cell cancer. And I got completely, I feel comfortable saying this, mentally ill for the Dear Evan Hansen soundtrack. I just felt like the music in the Dear Evan Hansen soundtrack was the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. The entire play is about grief. And it's still on my phone, even though my dad died in 2017. Every one of those songs is the most listened to music on my.
Yeah, wow. So that says something, huh?
Right. And now I listen to it and I'm like, it's pretty music. I'm not really sure what was going on with me then. Like, it doesn't do the same thing, but for whatever reason, I I was like a plug, an electrical wire, and it was a socket. And I think there's a lot of folks who, even thinking about C.S. Lewis spent most of his adult life without a partner. And then
she died so young.
And they were not together very long. So he
that's the
fell
thing.
deeply in love with this single mom. They had this partnership and friendship and equality that he never expected to have. I mean, he writes about it in lots of other places. And then she died. And he had a really hard time understanding how God could let that happen for a long time. So, again, I just feel like really grateful. Even when I'm like, ugh, this book is garbage and I don't want it. I assume it's not for me and it's for somebody else.
Or it's not for you now. That's the other thing. This is you and I, we get to have these conversations a lot, but I know when one just hits a chord, and there's so many things here. I've got a couple of personal questions for you, and you went there for a moment when you said, I don't know if I should say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'd love to know what's been some advice that not the advice, but let me rephrase this. How can I share this articulately? What has been some advice that you have taught or given that you've actually struggled to follow yourself?
Oh God, all of it. I really believe that at the root of being able to connect and process through grief is to be in touch with grief, which means you have to have a mindfulness practice. And I am probably at 46% every week at mindfulness. I sit down with the intention, but I know that everything is different when I do it. So I think it's more about, I do 5 minutes. I definitely get 5 minutes. I just, want to be able to stretch that. So that is probably the hardest tool and technique that I think, no, this is really good for you and you need this. And it's part of your grief practice and it's part of your values. And I go against them.
It's like exercise, huh?
It's, I didn't grow up with mindfulness practice. I grew up get up and go running, which is a mindfulness practice. Or
it's really in the last 2 decades that it's, started to become frontline mindfulness practices. Even in the last decade, it's everywhere. But yeah, of course,
depends on what you define as mindfulness practice, right? Because I think anyone who comes from a prayer culture would tell you that their culture starts with prayer, and that's probably mindfulness practice.
Of course. And maybe just the term mindfulness, quote unquote, is the coined phrase.
So I'm using it in the loosest idea, which is to just pay attention to this moment, these 5 minutes, just pay attention to who I am and how the electrical currents are moving through my body with no thoughts about anything else.
It's the hardest thing in the world to do.
It's really hard. And when we teach mindfulness in the Grief Mentor Method, we have, we give puzzles. Puzzles are mindfulness practice. We give walking meditations. We give guided meditation. We have mindful eating. There are a million ways to engage in mindfulness practice because it is so hard.
So
the other thing that I think, if I was being really honest, I know that relationships shift a lot in grief. Mine have shifted tremendously, partly because my entire work life sort of cracked open in a more public way. And I really advocate to the people that I work with and care about to let that be, to let it be, to let people be in seasons of your life to meet. And I also kind of can go down a little obsessive, what did I do wrong? And why did that have to be that way? And which is not the same as I deeply miss that person.
Sure.
Right. Or I deeply miss that relationship. I can go down this little, that's my fault and I'm bad for letting those things happen. And that's also a thing I'm practicing and that I'm working on. I'm working on believing that it's okay that your relationships really take a pivot and a shift.
That's so good. one of the things that a friend shared with me who went on a pregnancy journey for 9 years, and that's a big journey. He shared with me, he said that in that season for them, there were friends that came in and out and stayed, and as they journeyed through that grief. But he said, and I've never forgotten this, he said, there's friends for a reason, friends for a season, and friends for a lifetime. And I was just like, that reframed how I thought about all of the different circles that I moved in, and that it's okay to let it be and sometimes to let it go. Thanks for being honest. That's so good. So helpful. I've got a couple more questions for you before we wrap up. Is that cool? Because I'm just loving this. I would like to know, what has grief taught you about love that you never understood before loss?
That I never understood before loss. I'm not sure I really believed in unconditional love. It's almost like I need to take a step back, because my grief experience with my mom was really awful for everyone. I got really sick, and it's the subject of my memoir. I had PTSD. I had ruminations that were so relentless. It's what I treat, right? Like, I help people with these exact symptoms
Sure,
that I ended
yeah.
up having. I was so mad I had them, because I felt like I help people with this. I know everything about this. I should
Totally.
be inoculated for it.
Total expert syndrome.
But it was in the moment, it wasn't that hard. It was like, people say like, oh, I couldn't fall apart because of the kids. Well, I had kids and I fell all the way apart.
Mm-hmm.
And my falling apart had implications on lots of people. And the way in which the people who were most directly impacted have held me in grace, that does actually make me really emotional. So I think I thought of myself as unconditionally loved. And my mother said this to me on my wedding day. My husband and I had been together for 4 years before we got married. We were 30 when we got married. And I was like putting on my white dress, getting really excited. My mom said to me, and I was so mad at the time, she was like, you think this is the most important day of your life, but you have no idea how you are going to be called upon to love each other. Like, you can't even imagine. And I was like, F you, lady, like, don't be a party pooper. But when I think about how ill I became and how fast and what it required of, my siblings and my husband and my kids and some very dear friends. I mean, my very best friend, who's been my best friend since I was 11, she had some missteps with me when she was really trying to help me, because I had never been this way before. And I got so mad at her. I didn't speak to her for like 2 months. And that was awful for her. Like, I was the worst I ever was, and I refused to let her help me.
Wow.
And the grace with which she just was like, that's okay. Like, it hurt her so much. But I don't even think the word was forgave me. I don't think she ever even had to forgive me. And it was the same in my marriage. I mean, I came home and I was back from a treatment facility, but I was not well. And my husband, who never had to worry about birthday parties and making dinner, he was like, I'm doing it.
Wow.
So I think I thought I knew what it meant to be loved. And I think I never expected to need or receive the kind of love I ended up needing and receiving.
Thank you. I fully resonate with that. And what a powerful moment with your mom on your wedding day. In the midst of
she
anger
could be such a
rising up.
bummer. She always, every once in a while, she'd say things and I'm like, why do you have to look at that angle?
She sounds like,
but I've thought of it
mom.
so many times. We had miscarriages, we had deaths, we've had health issues, our kids have had health issues. Like, she was, my mom was married for 50 years. She wasn't wrong. She knew what she was talking.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do they say about mums? They're always right.
Yeah, right? I mean,
Always.
her timing was bad.
Yeah, so awesome. Oh, that's so good. Thank you. That's really beautiful. Final question I've got for you. I'd love to know that if you could go back and do things differently in your grief, would you? And if yes, what would you change?
I mean, I would, because I think I have a sense of what um the ways in which I accidentally abandoned myself so that that contributed to me getting sick.
Sure.
There's sort of two or three things. Like, one was I spent hours with my mom's body right after she died. And that really is the root of a lot of the PTSD that I had, was just sort of the images and the helplessness that I felt. And my husband wanted to come in the room at that time, and I should have let him in. I wish I had let him in, and I've done some therapy where I imagine that I let him in. So that moment of feeling alone doesn't feel so alone. And there were things like, I knew my brothers and sisters weren't going to want an autopsy. They also didn't feel responsible for my mom's death. I knew as I was sitting there, it was like this biblical moment where I was like, oh my God, I am betraying myself right now. They were like, nobody wants an autopsy. And I just was like, no. I'm not sure it would have mattered to have an autopsy, but I knew in the moment I was betraying myself. So I have a couple of things where it's like, if I had understood that my caring for me was the most important thing happening in that moment, that the person who was the most vulnerable in those moments was going to turn out to be me and not my kids or my husband or my sister or whomever, I do think I would go back and protect myself more.
Yeah, wow. That's super powerful. I didn't, because you could have gone either way there in terms of you would have or you wouldn't have gone back based on everything that you know and taught and been through with people and all of your studies. So I found that really fascinating. It's quite a heavy way to land as well. So maybe I'll throw in another question here, because let's bring some hope here. We started with feeling your feelings are a lie, and here we are talking about autopsy and reliving some of those things. So, I mean, how do you love to remember your mum? Like, what's one thing that you do? Is there a tradition? Like, where do you go when you're like, I just want to spend time with mum, celebrate her?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I have never been able to like have conversations with her out loud or in my head, but I can do the like, oh my God, are you seeing this? Like to her. And usually that's also the way that I miss her the most, is my mom had this capacity that was like infinite to listen to how much I wanted to brag about my kids, or how much I wanted to like talk about how much my neighbor was driving me crazy. Like however much I wanted to do, we were going to do that. And she was incredibly funny, incredibly smart, like a wicked kind of funny that
Good.
didn't come out until I was an adult. She was kind of like this mom librarian, sort of stiff upper lip. And then as we all sort of got into our teenage years, just like this whip smart, silly, ridiculous humor. So my mom loved all the videos of kids swearing, like Scottish kids swearing at sheep.
Yes.
She loved so those videos. So sometimes when I'm missing her, I'll just, you only have to watch one, and then your phone will auto populate. It's like 700. And my 16-year-old daughter she just loves to laugh. So she'll get in bed and watch those with me. My mom also ate cheesecake for breakfast pretty much every day.
Oh, I love your mom.
She was a riot, and she would be like, don't start with me. It has eggs. It has cheese. It has lemon.
That's what I say to my wife. She just shakes her head. I'd get along so well with your mom.
So, I mean, she also had high cholesterol. She should not be eating cheesecake. But so also like, being able to kind of think about her with cheesecake. And she also really loved true crime, like all the, the most appalling. They'll never stop writing about certain cases. And like, she's read all the books about all those cases. And so even though I am not a huge fan, my way of kind of loving and showing up for her was she would say, have you read this book? And I'd be like, no, of course I haven't read that book. And then she would tell me the whole book. So now I sort of am like, oh my God, Mom, look, there's a made for TV movie about the thing that you loved. And I can have a little bit of conversation. I will say, because my best friend has been my best friend since I was 11, and my sister and I are really close. I will call and be like, oh my God, this book. And then either one of them will be like, oh my God, your mom would have loved that.
That's your
book,
mom.
Or I had cheesecake today, or some lady had cheesecake and I was making me think about your mom. She had a lot of personality, and I love thinking about those parts of her personality.
So cool. Thanks so much. I'm going to have cheesecake for your mom this weekend. How about that?
Thank you.
Yeah, totally. Was there a specific flavor type? I'll get it.
She was pretty, she had this very funny story about my aunt who died not so long ago, that my aunt had this incredible recipe and everyone loved it. And she finally got the recipe off my aunt, but it couldn't have been the recipe because that's not what my aunt's cheesecake tastes like. She was hiding the recipe, but just a plain New York style cheesecake,
all right,
baked on a graham cracker crust, no flavors on top, just regular old cheesecake.
Straight up cheesecake.
That was her breakfast, a tiny little sliver of cheesecake. She was living it up.
I love that. So good. My wife's going to hate when I tell her that from this conversation.
It's not that different than a cheese Danish. To be honest, people eat worse things than cheesecake.
Meghan, this has been a joy. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. I'm so glad we finally connected. I'm so grateful for all the work that you guys put out. You do it with all my favorite things, curiosity and enthusiasm. And it's so perverse to say there's so much joy in this work. But if there's anything that I have come to understand about people who grieve really deep, is that we also love and laugh really, really hard. So I've been following your work for a while, and I'm really grateful for everything that you're doing.
Man, that's a huge blessing. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pop all of the links below for everyone to get your new book and everything else that you've got. So if you want that, jump in. But let's do it again. Let's keep in touch. This has been fun.
I love it. Anytime. That is amazing.
And when you're down under, we're taking you out here on the Gold Coast for some cheesecake and some other goodies.
I'll bring cheesecake with me on the plane. We'll be ready.
Sounds good. Appreciate
Thank you, Ryan.
Hey, well, I've hoped you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. I said to Meghan before we started we weren't going to fluff around, and I don't believe we did that. So I hope that something resonated with you on this episode that would either make you do one of two things: rate the podcast and let us know and let Meghan know that this has been valuable, or two, share it with somebody that came to mind during the episode that could really find this useful and helpful, because that's what we're here for at the end of the day. So until next time, from Kaylee, myself, and little 6-month-old Nazare, God bless, and we'll see you soon. Bye for now.